And joining us now, two of those correspondents. Susan Ormiston is in Washington and Chris Brown in London. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Ian.
So many big stories that you both covered. And Susan, I know you want to start by talking about being back in Kabul. It's a story that you've covered a lot over the years, but what was different this time around?
Oh gosh, everything. I mean, going into Afghanistan in September, Ian, was like kind of the negative image of the picture that was. I mean, we spent 2 decades, Canadians and allies, trying to prevent exactly what happened, the Taliban back in the presidential palace. In Kandahar, where, you know, our troops rumbled down dangerous roads, the Taliban back in control. I mean, I saw them sitting behind desks at the district center in Panjwai, the place, like a town hall that Canada built. They were behind desks at the police station. It was quite surreal. And what struck me was really still the desperation of so many Afghans begging still to get out in September and October. You know, young women had been in exams in universities. Suddenly they were kicked out of university classes. They're still not back. High schoolers told to stay home. The foreign money that's been pulled out of that country has left those with well-paying jobs with nothing, no income. Health clinics supported by international subsidies are collapsing. We still don't know whether this country can survive. What we do know is that millions of people are going to suffer this winter, Ian.
And Chris, like Susan, you've covered so many stories in the last year, but let's start with you on the stories as you covered the protests against the detention of the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny.
Alexei Navalny was perhaps the only opposition person in Russia who said he wanted to take on, defeat Vladimir Putin personally. His supporters took to the streets, and it was at one of those events, I recall quite vividly, we were out and there were perhaps thousands of people in this crowd, and they were all marching to the jail where Navalny was to kind of, you know, make a large protest. And off in the background, of course, we could see lots and lots of Russian security services, but they were far enough away, so we felt it was fine to kind of, you know, do a little bit of a show and tell what was going on. We were recording it, and on the second take, I got this distinct impression as we were doing it, like that something wasn't right. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see this phalanx of men in helmets with batons almost charging at us. And, you know, the thoughts are going through your head as you're still trying to talk, where it's like, well, they wouldn't dare beat us up. We're Western journalists. We're not doing anything wrong. But maybe they would. And so in the middle of that, like, you know, we suddenly felt extremely unsafe and just bailed off, almost ran away with the camera rolling.
Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.
And, you know, at that moment, you know, nothing happened to us at that particular time. But I can tell you that night and in the days afterwards, hundreds of people were brutally beat up, their families intimidated, in some cases even pulled from their homes. And as we know, in the months that followed, Navalny's entire organization was declared extremist and shut down. And so many of the people that I interviewed in the years that I was in Russia are now gone, forced to flee the country.
Yeah, and you know, you think about how experienced both of you are, Chris, and you kind of know where that line is that shouldn't be crossed when it comes to beating up journalists, as you point out, and clearly, you know, you had the sense that a line would be crossed there. So you had to do what you did and move out of there. And Susan, speaking of lines being crossed, we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of January 6th. I don't even know what to call it, insurrection, protest. You know, you can tell me the word, but I mean, whether it's focusing on that or even just generally politics in the United States, I'm curious about what it's like for you to be in the States covering it over the last few months.
Well, so much has shifted with Biden coming into power and Trump retreating, although he hasn't really retreated, Ian, because on January 6, 2022, in a couple of days, he's going to hold a news conference from Florida. So, never missing an opportunity to stir the pot. And you're going to see a lot of rear view mirror analysis this week about that big event last January 6th. I mean, there's huge investigations going on still. I don't know that Canadians realize them. You know, by the FBI and Department of Justice, over 700 people, 700 have been arrested in the U.S. for that insurrection protest on Capitol Hill. But You know, in people who've studied January 6th and that momentous event in the Capitol here in Washington, some of the most startling conclusions suggest that this wasn't a mob of extremists, right-wing fanatics. These were primarily people with jobs, businesses, professions from nearly all 50 states, some won by Trump, some won by Biden, a wide swath of Americans. And they identify with Stop the Steal, and they believe that Trump's second term was stolen, and guess what? They still do. So the underpinnings of January 6th are still circulating in the U.S., and of course, we'll see what President Trump and President Biden have to say about it in a couple of days.
So I had an hour with you on Cross Country Checkup. I only have 8 or 9 minutes tonight. So let's finish with this, Chris. We have about a minute. You were at the climate conference in Glasgow. You know, a lot of criticism about what didn't happen there. What was it like to be a reporter in the middle of all of that?
I think this politically was a big year for the climate. There was a very high level of engagement globally. It was fueled by crazy headlines like the highest ever temperature in the Arctic of 38 degrees, heat domes, as Canadians well know, in the western part of the country. For me, what stood out about the Glasgow Climate Conference was, you know, there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, but there was actually an immense amount of goodwill. I was not at the end very pessimistic or cynical about it. I was particularly moved, in fact, by David Attenborough, the 95-year-old environmentalist, the British environmentalist, really considered a national treasure, delivered one of the most mesmerizing speeches that I've ever heard.
The people alive now or the generation to come will look at this conference and consider one thing. Did that number stop rising and start to drop as a result of commitments made here? There's every reason to believe that the answer can be yes. If working apart, we are force powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it.
And when I look at it, you know, they said going into this, it was going to go up 2.9 degrees over the next 20, 30 years. Now, if everyone, all the countries do what they say they're going to do, they could keep it to 1.8. Obviously, it's not the 1.5 target they wanted, and there's a lot of criticism about that. But I think it's hard on balance looking back at it, to say that COP26 wasn't at least a moderate success.
Oh, it's been really interesting looking back at it. Some of the stories each of you covered over the last year. Hope you had a good rest, because who knows what's ahead. Thanks to both of you.
Happy New Year.